So, comrades, this is the Left Dialogue Forum. The Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, whose board I chair, has been convening it now for about 4 years. And essentially, it's a closed space. It's by invite. It's largely centered on frontline activists. We invite intellectuals like Stephen and others, or other activists that may not want to be part of the space directly, but to come and engage with us. And the purpose of this forum has been to step back from activism and to take stock of the big picture, and to frame sort of broad strategic perspective. But the second purpose of the forum is to create a safe space, to really do the deep dive, to go beyond the kind of populism and the kind of sloganeering that's there in the everyday of our politics, and to really think deeply about issues. And the third thing about the space is to really kind of, in a sense, humanize our politics. There are too many divides and divisions, and to really find each other. And so it's been an amazing journey for the past few years. Now we've targeted individuals because the political space is very divided. Many people want to sit in this space, but they don't want to sit as representatives of particular organizations and so on. We have very, very close trade union friends who've journeyed with us over the years, but that's also created problems for them. And so being here in the individual capacity gives them some license to participate. Now, in the course of our journey, we've done various things. We've looked at a bit of the crisis of national liberation politics. We've done it at a micro level. We've had activists talk to us about how schools don't work, water systems don't work, etc. We've had input around issues related to the ruling party. We've had issues around the resurgent racisms in our society and globally. We've had inputs on climate, and we've been constantly trying to work out where we are. We've had a big debate with international friends around internationalism and renewing internationalism. We had people from the new International of Workers and Parties, from the Eco-Socialist International. We had representative, or rather a person arguing for a world party, join us and have a debate, etc. And then, of course, the last round of dialogue has been about exploring the question of a left party for South Africa. Again, a kind of experiment, a kind of provocation to get us to think deeply about this. And we've come to a very interesting place in that conversation. I mean, recognizing, for example, that proportional representation has been used in a particular way by the dominant party. Can the left use proportional representation differently? I think that's a very interesting question. How do you democratize our democracy? And what is the role of multi-party competition, etc.? And there's been some interesting contributions to that debate. Some arguing we just need a straight up left party, others arguing no, movements come first, and so on and so on. And so that debate is maturing, and we'll be kind of surfacing a set of perspectives on that for public engagement. But today we felt this convening was important just to take stock again of what's happening. What's been happening in the context of the pandemic? What are the dynamics? And what does this mean? I mean, this pandemic clearly is here to stay, according to some perspectives, and it means we have to adapt and live with COVID. If you listen to Abdul Karim, for instance. On the other hand, there's a worsening crisis in this context, economic crisis, and so on. And then the second important development in our democracy has been the violence of July, which wrenched through our society. And it's again important to reflect on this, and to take stock of it. So to take us through all of this, we're convening two panels. The first panel is on the political ecology of COVID-19 and worsening crisis. And here we've invited Natalya, who's a doctor as well, and who's been part of this process for a long time, to share her perspective. Stephen Friedman, who's also written a book on COVID. And so I reached out to Stephen to come and join us and to share his perspective, and then myself. And then the second panel is on public violence in South Africa's destabilization or uprising. So how do we characterize this? Was it an insurrection? Or was it just about inciting chaos to bargain for Jacob Zuma? So there's all kinds of narratives swirling around it, but how do we characterize it? But more importantly, what's happened on the ground in communities? And here we've invited several contributors, Wande Buthelezi, Roshan Jainath, Crispin Hampson, Des Dessa, and we did try to reach out to Abba Shlali. I was speaking to their chairperson, George Bono, throughout the week. He was very committed to coming, but he's also overcommitted. So we'll see how that plays out. So these are the two substantive sessions for today, and we're hoping this will take us up until till 2 o'clock. We felt this engagement was important given all these developments, and given that we are working on a set of perspective documents, as I said, one on the global and national crisis, the other on democratizing criminalized market democracy, and the third on towards the left party. So this conversation will help us think critically about these recent developments. I must table apologies for Michelle as well. She has a commitment at WITS today, but she'll try and join us in between things. Jane, are there any other apologies from anyone? I think Ferial Adam also sends her apologies. She has another commitment. Jane, are there any other apologies from anybody?
There was an apology from Andrew Binney and Dinga. I think that's all.
Okay, perfect. So without further ado, we're going to move forward with our first panel. Awande, I think you are chairing this. Are you here? Yeah.
Thank you, Vish. So now we'll move on to our first panel, which is titled The Political Ecology of COVID-19 and Worsening Crisis. We have our speakers, Natalya, Dinat, Stephen Friedman, and Vishwas Satgar, and every speaker will be getting 15 minutes. So without further ado, we'll begin with our first speaker, Natalya, sorry. And please, for the speakers, I'd just like to let you know that I will be sending you messages via the chat with regards to how much time you have left. So I'd like to not be too interruptive, but I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes left and so forth. But if we go over time, then I will just intervene and let you know that your time is up. So without further ado, Natalya, you may go. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I was asked to talk about the political ecology of COVID-19 and the worsening crisis. So, I mean, unfortunately, you're not going to get that because I'm not a political scientist and the language is not really familiar to me. However, I am a Marxist, or claim to be a Marxist. And so I will frame my talk in that way. But it's interesting because my talk is very much around sort of, or brings in one of the question of language. And so it's an example of the problems that we encounter as a medical doctor. And I will be discussing the solution. We need to really develop, I think, as Marxists, a uniting language and a uniting philosophy that we can talk to one another. So what I will argue is that only a Marxist, and to introduce a new term, an Engelist, because Engels' approach towards philosophy of science and scientific method is key. So only this approach towards the natural science, including medical science, can save us. So we really need to unite at a philosophical level. So can I share my screen? Thanks.
Yes, it's visible now.
Yep, thank you. Have you got it?
Yes, I think you can just try make your presentation. Oh, okay, yeah, there it is. Perfect.
Yep. Okay, so it's a huge topic, so I'm just going to concentrate on one aspect with 3 points about the question of following the science and what is the science. So the 3 points I'd like to make today is that the logic of today's capitalism has produced the pandemic and is even profiting from it. So not only is it, a mistake, but they found a way to profit from it. And I would argue that the science and following the science alone cannot save us. And this is really because the agenda of the science and the scientific and biomedical especially are not ideologically neutral. And the dominant discourse in the scientific world broadly is that of neoliberals and neoliberalism and pushing their agenda and their interests. And I would also, so I think that's pretty straightforward for many people and not really controversial, but I would also like to discuss that and argue that the methods of science are not ideologically neutral. So those are the 3 points that I'm going to make. So capitalism has produced crises, we know, of economic crisis, crisis in democracy, crisis in the ecological systems, and in the ecological systems, especially crisis in access to water, coming crisis in seed and access to seed and food, crisis of the soil and the planet, and especially crisis in health and population health, including that of, caused by the refugees and war crises. But as some people, I think, wrote in monthly review, I think that Rob Wallace was writing earlier on that they were expecting with the pandemic of COVID-19 a sudden catastrophic crisis of capitalism, like akin to a zombie apocalypse. And the neoliberal media has also like to sort of, pick this up to make us all very scared. We're not seeing that sudden sort of apocalyptic or catastrophic crisis, but we are seeing continuous erosion of our world and, ruptures left, right, and center. So that would be in climate and people's health, etc. And this is all sort of because of interlinking issues such as wars, extractivism, big farming. And I think what people haven't really spoken about is big pharma, the big pharmaceutical companies. We know that the pharmaceutical industry or sector, I think it was the second largest profit-making industry, second to the military industrial complex. And I think it's gone down to the third largest. But pharmaceutical and health industries, along with the seed and food and water access, are, I think, the issues of huge contention and problems. But the pharmaceuticals have been ignored to a large extent. So these are all interlinked, which I guess talks to the political ecology of it. And I would say that the answer is, especially in the sciences, we need to revisit a Marxist approach to this. The research agenda of science is not ideologically neutral. And we can see, and this has been really very sort of interesting when we look at the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems with colonialism. The colonialism had to destroy the scientific knowledge, or we call it indigenous knowledge, that has been existing in the, and developed over the past 50,000 years in order to enslave people and plunder the colonies. So the research agenda, first of all, had to destroy, and I think what Boaventura calls epistemicide, had to destroy what was existing and what I would say is very congruent with Marxist scientific philosophy and dialectical materialism. We see it very clearly in many indigenous knowledges. So I think that there's no no rupture, no dissonance between looking at indigenous knowledge systems, looking at the world through that type of science, and the sort of very technological modern science. We see that scientific agendas have driven the development of nuclear weapons, agribusiness, big farming, mining, and so, for example, and even touching pharmaceuticals. So, for example, we know that Bayer, developed as a company who made the CS gas in the Nazi gas chambers, Monsanto was the company that made Agent Orange, which they used liberally in Vietnam, and the effects of which we're still seeing today. And the two have been, Bayer have bought over Monsanto, and they have now become the world's largest supplier of seeds and agrochemicals. And Bayer continues to sell its pharmaceutical products around the world. So this is interesting because the history of the research agenda of these companies is really, really quite dark. And I know this guy who was homeless and is now living in Sunsprait, and he's very, very skeptical about the vaccines for COVID-19. And he said, no, this thing is a slow poison. And when we sort of try and understand why people in South Africa aren't taking up the vaccine in large numbers, it is probably or partly because, or partially because of this history that the pharmaceuticals have and their research agenda, the neoliberal research agenda. So we know that Tuskegee, that was a natural experiment in syphilis that went on until the 1970s, where despite the fact that there was a cure for syphilis in antibiotics, people in the area of Tuskegee in America were denied treatment as they watched their children and children's children being affected and infected by syphilis. So my daughter, in fact, she told me that when we were talking about the vaccines, she asked me, isn't Johnson & Johnson the same company that produced the cancer-causing medicine, which is absolutely true. And here we have a real sort of a situation where the company, the same company that sprays carcinogens on our food, now sells cancer-treating drugs. So Johnson & Johnson have had a massive, fine, which they have actually not paid for producing, when they knew that their product, their talcum powder product, and it was specially promoted and sold in the Black communities for Black women, and especially in South Africa, that you had to smell clean and use liberally the talcum powder. And even today, we find Johnson & Johnson talcum powder on the shelves in South Africa, where we know that it causes cancer. And they have been fined, I think they were fined $2.1 billion US dollars for the asbestos containing baby powder. And they continue to be fined. And this is really nothing. It's not really hitting their profit margins at all. So people are suspicious generally when these companies that bring you cancer-causing medicines and products are also offering you vaccines. Also, I think there were examples in pharmaceuticals such as Primidos, which is a hormonal drug that was given to women throughout, when the companies knew that they caused severe birth defects, Primidos was given to women until the 1970s as a hormonal pregnancy test. We knew about thalidomide that produced all sorts of problems, and the companies continued to sell it. And other research agendas in science, you know, for example, the Nazi era science, the Nazi science, the eugenic science, the apartheid science, all makes us very, very suspicious of such things. So today, Johnson & Johnson are facing over 25,000 lawsuits, and they've set aside over $4 billion to fight their legal battles, still not affecting their bottom line of profit. So lastly, I would like to talk a little bit about the fact that the scientific methods are not neutral. Biomedical science has been based on a reductionist philosophy, where we are really the sum of our parts, and we see this every day in medicine when we go to the doctor, and then the doctor sends us to a neurologist to look at our nervous system, and then he says, okay, but I think you need to see a cardiologist to look at your heart. And then the cardiologist will look at the heart and then think, I think you need to see a hematologist. And we see this in COVID all the time for people who have medical aid, and even in the state sector. This thinking that human beings are, number one, the sum of our parts, and that if we treat individual systems, we will somehow get good results. And COVID-19 has shown very clearly that that's not the case. It is a disease that affects multiple organs in our body. So that is one of the issues there. So the Cartesian dualism, which drives the philosophy of modern medicine today, also says that the mind and body are separate, and that, you know, whereas science is basically saying that this is not the case, and our mind and body do have a dialectical connection, and they do affect each other. And at WITS, I mean, I would describe an experiment, a very interesting experiment in pain that was published in the Journal of Brain, where people were asked to look and observe their partner, their life partner, having pain inflicted on them, and then they would do a functional MRI scan, a brain scan of the observer, and they would map pain areas, or that's what they intended to do, map empathy areas in the brain. And then to their surprise, they found that the pain areas were being upregulated. So our mind can cause physically measurable, physiologically measurable pain in the body, and pain can change our mind. We know that kidney disease can cause depression, heart disease can cause long-term depression. So we can't separate these things. We cannot have a mechanistic approach, and also an approach that is this hierarchical approach that says man is at the top of the pyramid of nature and somehow we are the pinnacle of evolution. Other areas where scientific methods have been shown to be not neutral is in our history and the history of the eugenics society, where, for example, Pearson and Fisher, who were the founders of today's biostatistics, and people who have been involved in statistics would know of the Fisher exact test and the Pearson coefficient, were eugenicists, and they developed that science to justify their racist theories. So even today, the concept of the Malthusian concept of herd immunity and Boris Johnson's let the bodies pile up and let it COVID sweep through the population are reactionary, racist, and this is what we're basing our science on in terms of, very much in terms of COVID-19. Herd immunity is a defunct neoliberal science.
Sorry, Natalya, just to let you know, we have gone over time, so you have to.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
so I'll just finish up then. So I just want to talk about Richard Lewontin, who died unfortunately in July of this year. He was a Marxist. He was a top-notch scientist in molecular biology, populations biology, and then he wrote with Richard Levins, The Dialectical Biologist. So he, there is a space for us as scientists looking at dialectics. Okay, so then structural One Health, which the left scientists have asked for, is to really call for commodity, that they understand commodity chains as the drivers of epidemics, but also I would add big pharma, and that we need a dialectical science and biology if we're going to address the interlinked multiple crises of today. And to actually have a radical reconstruction of science. So I think that's all, yeah. Thank you.
thank you very much. And now we will have our next speaker, Stephen Friedman.
Right, thanks, Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to engage on these issues. As Vishwas mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, I have written a book on COVID in South Africa, on the politics of COVID in South Africa, which will be published towards the end of the year. I do want to talk to the argument in the book, and then at the end, just say a couple of things on what I think this means for the future. The book looks at what I think is the prevailing myth about South Africa's response to COVID-19. And I think the prevailing myth goes something like this, that in contrast to the official response to HIV and AIDS, what happened this time is that the government embraced the science, that it worked with the scientists to the benefit of the society, and that this enabled us so far to deal reasonably effectively with COVID-19 and to ensure that the damage it did to the society was limited. Now, I think one part of this is understandable because I've also written quite a lot on HIV and AIDS, and obviously we're aware that during that epidemic, the hostility of government towards any kind of attempt to use science in order to deal with the pandemic was a major reason why many more people got ill and died than should have. So I mean, it is perhaps understandable in that context that people should have felt this way. But the reality was rather different. The reality was that the response to COVID-19 was actually not unlike in human terms, not unlike the response to HIV and AIDS, in the sense that a great many more people have fallen ill and have died than needed to. I point out in the book that certainly throughout 2020, which is the period in which the book mainly deals last year, that South Africa's official COVID-19 deaths and case numbers were roughly equal to those of the rest of the African continent combined. So in other words, if you tot up our figures and you tot up that of another 53 countries, you get roughly the same figure. And the standard response to this is to say, oh no, well, we do lots of testing and they don't. But that doesn't actually explain it, because if you look at the rest of the continent, you look at hospital admissions and you look at deaths, they're also a fraction of what South Africa has experienced. So the country on the continent with the most sophisticated, in inverted commas, medical infrastructure, both in terms of medical technology and in terms of claims to medical expertise, did worst in fighting HIV and AIDS. And what I argue is that we didn't do badly as a country, despite the fact that we have all this medical technology. We did badly because we have all the medical technology, or perhaps more accurately, because the fact that we have this medical technology reflects the reality which explains this country's response to HIV and AIDS. And during 2020, one of the interesting features globally of COVID-19, which is pretty trite because many people have mentioned it, is that just as a broad generalization, countries with also very sophisticated medical technology did far worse at dealing with COVID-19 than countries which did not have that technology. So the worst hit countries were, I mean, we have Brazil as some kind of outlier, which you know, has all sorts of complexities which we could talk about. But if you take Brazil out of the equation, you know, the worst hit countries are the United States and Western Europe, where a lot of this technical expertise is concentrated. And South Africa, of course, wasn't that different. And what I argue is that the reason South Africa wasn't different is because the global divide, if you like, runs straight through South African society. So in other words, if you take, and I'm afraid I do use it in inverted commas in the book because I couldn't think of anything better, and I know it's ideologically loaded, and I don't like it very much myself, but the sort of standard difference between first world and third world. And the first world is, of course, this hub of sophistication, whereas the third world is about poverty and violence and need. That international division runs right through South Africa. And I mean something a bit deeper here than the obvious observation that South Africa is a deeply unequal society. I mean that there are two worlds in South Africa. And that obviously doesn't mean that the worlds are homogeneous. It doesn't mean that they don't interact with each other. It doesn't mean that they don't influence each other. And I do mention that in the book. But the way in which life is lived in the suburbs, and if you use the suburbs as a metaphor for the formal economy, is very different to the way in which life is lived everywhere else. The priorities are different, the concerns are different, the realities are different. And it's tried to point out that the life experience of a woman who has to get into a crowded taxi every morning in order to feed her children is very different from that of somebody sheltering at home with the latest electronic technology. The priorities of the people sheltering at home, the way in which they see the world, what matters and what doesn't matter, is very different depending on which of those worlds you inhabit. And of course, it will come as no surprise to learn that the world that actually decides what will happen in South Africa is the one that corresponds to the first world, is the world of the suburbs. And throughout COVID-19 in this country, the agenda has been driven by the suburbs. It's been driven by that, in inverted commas, first world. And this has had some very interesting consequences. The one consequence it has is that from the very beginning of the pandemic, we surrendered. And by we, I mean in inverted commas, the scientific establishment and the government surrendered before the first shot was fired. In mid-April 2020, Salim Abdul Karim, who was mentioned earlier, who was then co-chair of the Ministerial Advisory Committee, announced that a severe epidemic in South Africa was inevitable. In fact, he went so far not only to do that, but in a much commented on slide presentation, he actually suggested that one of our responses right at the beginning should be to deal with bereavement and mass funerals. Now, Dr. Karim based that claim on the assertion that no country in the world was able to avoid a severe epidemic, and therefore South Africa was not some kind of magical exception. The problem with that statement made in April 2020 is that, to put it bluntly, it was false. It wasn't true in April 2020 to say that no country had avoided a severe epidemic. In fact, it's not even true now to say that no country has avoided a severe epidemic. South Korea, which has almost the identical population to us, I think the last time I looked, their death toll from COVID-19 is in the hundreds. So, you know, it was a false statement. Why did a prominent epidemiologist make a statement which simply didn't bear any reference to reality? Because when Professor Karim, like all his scientific colleagues, say that no country in the world could avoid a severe epidemic, what they were actually saying is that no country in the world that matters could avoid a severe epidemic. And the countries in the world that matter to suburban South Africa are the countries, are Western Europe and North America. And if you look at, because I'm running out of time now, if you look, I mean, I'm picking on Salim Abdul Karim because he started the process and he was the joint chair. But his views are in fact somewhat more flexible than those of the rest of the scientific establishment, who have throughout, with government echoing it, claimed that there is absolutely nothing we can do about mass illness, mass disease, mass death, basically. And the point I make is that if you look at the science, in inverted commas, internationally, and of course the science is always contested, what has passed for the science in South Africa is actually internationally quite a fringe position. It's roughly the same kind of science as you saw in something called the Great Barrington Declaration, which was put out by a group of right-wing scientists who were then rushed off to an urgent meeting at the Trump White House to talk to Trump's health secretary. That has been fundamentally the framework which South African scientists have been applying and which has become the mainstream. Throughout this period, in a society which whose suburban elite questions just about anything the government does, not a single critical question has been asked in 18 months of any South African scientist. In fact, not only has no critical question been asked about them, they have been lionized, celebrated, when they have, as I said earlier, peddled throughout a version of the science which has far more to do with right-wing ideology than it does with any kind of professional consensus. That's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that the response, because of this, the response to the pandemic has been throughout a response which has been refracted through the lens of suburban South Africa, and therefore through the lens of Britain, North America, Western Europe, etc. When we talk about how good, how sophisticated Western medicine, in inverted commas, is, what we need to bear in mind that is it's sophisticated in a particular way. It is very high-end curative medicine, which means it's about curing people who get ill. It's not about preventive medicine. And the most obvious point about COVID-19 is that there's no cure. So curative medicine is not very useful when there's no cure. However, our entire response to COVID-19 has been based on the idea that curative medicine is absolutely essential. So we have this bizarre situation in which, if you look at what the scientists said, the priority has never been saving life. The priority has been saving the health system. The health system has been kind of fetishized into this goal in a society which is actually supposed to be concerned with the welfare of the people who live in it, because it's assumed that curative medicine solves all problems, and therefore, if you can squeeze people into the health system, that's what you do. It's incidentally the reason why vaccines, which are very important and which probably saved my life a few weeks ago, but why vaccines have been touted as the only response. So I've got 1 minute left, and there's obviously a lot more to cover, etc. The point that I'm making is that we've done very badly at dealing with HIV, with COVID-19, because our entire response has reflected the divisions in the society. One point I haven't had time to talk about is that a lot of the measures which suburban people became very angry about, the lockdown measures, the bans on alcohol, bans on tobacco, etc., these weren't aimed at the suburbs. These were aimed at the townships and the shack settlements, because part of the division in South Africa is that suburban South Africa, first world South Africa, whatever it wants to call itself, infantilizes people in the townships and the shack settlements. So instead of doing what Kerala did in India and what other parts of the world are doing, instead of trying to form a partnership with people in townships and shack settlements to fight COVID-19, it was assumed that they were either too stupid or too recalcitrant to stick by any of the rules, and the only way they could be forced to look after themselves was 73,000 troops ensuring that they obeyed a whole lot of laws, which, as I show in the book, the cabinet ministers themselves acknowledged were about controlling the townships rather than the shack settlements. So I think that's a very broad outline of what I'm trying to say. The obvious point is, where does that take us now? And the point I want to make is that clearly our prospects of getting out of this in a way which is even vaguely humane, getting out of a situation where it will come as no surprise, and maybe Vishwas will talk about this at greater length, that the effects, the social and economic effects of COVID-19 have been felt disproportionately by people living in poverty. Is there a way out of this? And I think the obvious answer, in the short term, probably no. And the reason why in the short term, probably no, is that this is so much a symptom of the divisions within the society that I've described, that the only way out of this is to challenge the divisions, which is obviously not something which is going to have effects in the next couple of weeks, or the next couple of months, or even the next couple of years. So to sum up, I think that COVID-19 is in South Africa is a response, is a reflection of some very deep-rooted realities in the society. And if we want to talk about getting out of this, Unfortunately, what we have to talk about is a long process of trying to change the society. I don't think that we can really deal with COVID-19 with the society we have at the moment. So sorry for going a bit over time, but hopefully this has given you a sense of the argument. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input. And now we'll be moving to our final speaker, Dr. Vishwas Satgar.
Thanks, Awande. So I was asked by the late Leo Panich in 2019 to make a contribution to the Socialist Register on what are the deep contradictions determining and defining South African society today. And then, of course, in 2020, COVID hit and Leo passed on, actually, because of a COVID infection. So the next issue of the Socialist Register is dedicated to him. So in that context, I wrote a piece from a Marxist ecology perspective. I finished it in sort of late April, early May, just before the third wave started kicking in South Africa this year. And so we've shared that piece as one of many. And, you know, we invite people in the space to actually write up their notes and stuff so we can share that as resources. So the piece is titled Epidemiological Neoliberalism in South Africa. And I'll just speak to some key ideas in the piece. But the first point to make is that when thinking about South Africa's contradictions that are at the heart of polarization, I do it from a Marxist ecology perspective. And here I'm thinking about systemic contradictions that go to the heart of socio-ecological reproduction of the entire society in a general sense. And I'll come back to that in a more concrete way just now. But the second point to make is that it's not about thinking South Africa through some kind of ideal type neoliberalism, but really looking at how it's been translated, how it has been articulated within political economy in the South African context. So that's the second important point. The third important sort of premise of this piece is that COVID-19 has to be understood as a conjunctural development. It's a conjunctural development in the sense that it has shaped the global political economy and it's ramified through it. And it has forced a change in how ruling classes govern. It has forced them to actually reinvent how they rule. Now, in the South African context, that has not necessarily meant a break with neoliberalizing logic. So neoliberalism is normally studied as a kind of logic of financialization and so on. But in this piece, I go beyond that to kind of really try and understand what are the strategies of rule at a policy level that came to the fore in the midst of COVID-19. And I'll get into that quickly just now. Now, the ANC's class project is a crisis-ridden one. It's a class project that has really, if you like, reached a point of exhaustion, in my view. So we had an adoption of sort of neoliberal policies in the early 90s. The argument was made that these were just temporary. They were meant to stabilize the economy, manage state debt, etc. But in the end, a virtue was made out of necessity. This contingent development became an entrenched trajectory of the society. And we've seen it evolve in different sort of periods, you know, sort of a hegemonic period with Mandela's rule, passive revolution with Mbeki, criminalized accumulation with Jacob Zuma, and so on. And ultimately producing a thin market democracy. In that context, also, we've seen the ANC-led alliance basically degenerate. And some of its political practices, whether it's propagandistic patronage networks, etc., using voter banks. I mean, we're seeing this in the Zondo Commission around how criminalized accumulation is linked to that nexus between the ruling party and voting and so on. But in the end, a great deal of anger coming out of the townships, as Stephen was speaking about the townships. And you saw that expressed in a shift in 2016. At an institutional level, this alliance has also been rupturing over time. And we've had 3 breakaways, whether it's the COPE, the EFF, and of course the NIMSA moment. But all of these thrusts have not really been emancipatory, and they have various limits to them. So you don't have a politics, a counter-hegemonic politics that's speaking to the deep socio-ecological polarization and contradictions within the general crisis of South African capitalism. And these contradictions are interconnected, they imbricate, and they are shaping each other. Now, in the midst of COVID-19, we basically reimagined rule in this country, or rather the state reimagined rule in this country. And basically what I argue here is that it took a technocratic approach and a top-down approach. And essentially we had 3 key sort of policy thrusts defining epidemiological neoliberalism. I mean, the first being around how socioeconomic hardship was managed. The first being socioeconomic mitigation. And here it was really about trying to soften the blow and kind of using various mechanisms to kind of come to the fore. Whether it was the TERS relief, whether it was the employment, whether it was the loan guarantee scheme, etc. A lot of this really comes short in the South African context. The second sort of thrust is around the lockdown regime, and the lockdown regime was really always balanced against accumulation requirements in South Africa. And so you see it after the level 5 lockdown in 2020. There was a concerted attempt to kind of keep the economy open. I mean, the second wave hits us full throttle, November into December. And there's only a sort of state kind of pushback after the Christmas shopping rush, etc., etc. And suddenly, we're told that masks are now compulsory and so on and so on. So the requirements of accumulation were always very, very important in this regulatory regime. And we're seeing that now, even in the context of the third wave and how it's been managed. The other important element is around socio-economic recovery and the state president's economic recovery and reconstruction plan. The thing about this plan is that it's been embedded in an austerity framework and linked to fiscal consolidation, which is really about cutting public expenditure in the midst of this pandemic. Now, the ANC itself gave itself limited choices because of corruption, mismanagement of state-owned enterprises, and so on. And so all this fiscal leakage essentially caught up with it in the midst of this pandemic. So these are sort of the main thrusts of what I would call epidemiological neoliberalism. And it kind of intersects with a set of contradictions that are impacting socio-ecological reproduction of the society. The first is the healthcare system. And the important point here is that we went into COVID-19 with a relatively dysfunctional healthcare system, trying to meet the needs of 50 million people in our population, about 9 million people dependent on private medical aids. So this duality kind of played itself out at the heart of this pandemic. We didn't have enough beds actually in ICUs to deal with this in South Africa. But essentially, we had a healthcare crisis before this pandemic, and this alarm bell has been rung loud by various voices in our society, the Treatment Action Campaign, and many, many others. So we went into the pandemic with a healthcare system that was already failing. And we faced the pandemic with 1,250 intensive care beds, mainly in public hospitals. And so we were really under-resourced and in an incapable situation to deal with this. And hence, when you think about the epidemiological neoliberal approach, it was about trying to manage this crisis. So the lockdown regime as we've heard, was really about trying to win time to put in place an effective healthcare response. And in that context, we've seen various problems. The emphasis on alcohol, etc., was really about trying to occlude or deflect away from failures of governance even before COVID. But essentially, healthcare workers had to face this pandemic and remake their workspaces in an under-resourced context, precarious working conditions, and so on. And the excess deaths speak for themselves. When I looked at the second wave data coming out of the Medical Research Council, Eastern Cape was hit really, really hard, 420 per 100,000 of the population, compared to the national average of 258 per 100,000. Nursing unions have been at the front line of pushing back against a lot of this crisis in the healthcare system. Unemployment and hunger has been also another important polarizing or socio-ecological contradiction. And I wrote this piece before the July violence in South Africa. But what's striking for me is when setting out the data about the squeeze on the working class and so on in South Africa, 30 million people were in food stress. We have a low wage economy, and I've got all the data here. I'm not going to go into it. But it was very, very clear that the epidemiological neoliberal response to the society was barbaric. And I actually use that language in this piece because it was really squeezing a society that was deeply precarious and pushing it over the edge. And this is the point about this argument. Greg Albo, who's the editor of Socialist Register, said he was watching the television in July. And he said, the piece spoke to him, basically. He could understand why people the discontent was bursting out on the streets, etc. Anyway, so the unemployment crisis, the hunger crisis, all of these things kind of fed into the crisis of socio-ecological reproduction, and the epidemiological neoliberal approach came very short. But there was a pushback from across progressive civil society to really unlock the commons and ensure that solidarities fill the gap of state failure. Then, of course, climate shocks have also continued, again, with disproportionate impacts. The drought lingered in the Eastern Cape. We saw disproportionate impacts over the past 7 years. The approach to water tanks was a band-aid, and it came really short. There was a lot of attempt to spotlight, at least from the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, the need to find systemic solutions to the water crisis. But generally, the COVID economic recovery and reconstruction plan is about reproducing the coal-fired based minerals energy complex. Offshore extraction is vaunted as a game changer and so on. And now we got the car power ship stuff. So, but in that context, the Climate Justice Charter was very, very important. To conclude, the limits to epidemiological neoliberalism are several as well, and we've got to put that into perspective. These over 2 decades of neoliberalization has produced a corrupt and a failing state, and it's just not capable of cushioning society, a deeply unequal society, and this is coming back to haunt the ruling party and the ruling class in the society. The other point to make is that there's a rupturing going on in the National Liberation Bloc. There are fluid realignments here. And but at the same time, this doesn't mean it's moving to the left. The EFF, the Freedom Front Plus also stand to benefit from this context of deep social discontent. And then ultimately, if the EFF does benefit from this, we're heading towards greater racial conflict in the society. And then lastly, just to make the point that we are in a new cycle of resistance in this conjunctural moment, and how we navigate this and how forces converge is going to be very defining for the future of this country. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much to our 3 speakers. Now that we have concluded the inputs from the speakers, we will now be moving to our discussion point. We were supposed to have 45 minutes for this section, but I do appreciate the fact that we began a bit later than before, so I'm not sure. I just need some guidance here, but can we move it to 11:50? Will we still have that 45 minutes for the discussion, or must we cut it short?
Let's see how it goes on one day.
Okay. With that being said, we'll move now straight into our discussion session. So please, can you just raise your hand in the chat and I will recognize you as chair. Please try to keep your inputs brief to allow for the speakers to respond and for others to also be given the opportunity to make their points. I will begin with a point for myself, which touches on a point made by Stephen and Vish, particularly the point that Vish made now about the requirements of accumulation and the focus on keeping the economy open being the primary focus through which the state has chosen to address this crisis. And the point that Stephen made about how we'd already given up before the first shot was fired, which is also an indication of the way in which our government has approached our other big problems: inequality, social, ecological, and economic problems. That we in South Africa have had a politics of damage control rather than actually facing these issues head on and addressing them. And I think COVID has helped clarify that. It's also solidified the way in which our orientation to how things can and should be done is primarily, Western, through a Western lens regarding our perspective on things. But I think that globally, it's been made clear that the West doesn't have all the answers. And I think that came out really strong in this pandemic. Kerala, Vietnam, South Korea, and a number of other countries have done comparatively well in addressing this crisis compared to a number of other big players from the West. So I think that does give hope. But unfortunately, we're dealing with the same government, which has not learned from a number of historical examples. Is there anyone who'd like to go first? I'm not seeing any hands as of yet, so I'll just like to then issue a question on my to the three panelists in light of the point that I've just made now. What gaps or what hope do you see with regards to us being able to change this perspective that we have of this heavily, Western focus on how we should manage things, or this pessimism of having already given up on being able to keep things under control, protect lives, and ensure a equitable response to some of these crises? Has there been anything in the way of how things have been done in this pandemic, or the way that society has responded, that gives you hope with regards to how we can address future crises and some of the other historical issues that we've been facing as a country? That question is just addressed broadly to the three speakers, so anyone can take that while we wait for hands.
Yeah, one day I'll just break the ice. I'll wait for Stephen and Natalya to come in as well. I really think that we got to think about democratization. We on the ground beat this drum a lot throughout COVID-19 through the National Food Crisis Forum convened by the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. And we beat that drum in relation to the Disaster Management Act. We studied it, we got experts to come and present to us on it, and we made this call systematically and consistently throughout. We saw the state food response fail, whether through the Solidarity Fund or the Department of Social Development. And we saw how communities were basically unlocking the food commons A parallel food system was developing, etc. And there was a disconnect between that and the state. And so I think this was one of the big gaps, and the state wasn't willing to listen, to democratize the Disaster Management Act, which provides for civil society to come in and to work with the state and to address this challenge. I think this overlaps with what Stephen was also talking about. In places like Kerala, and we actually hosted the Minister of Finance in 2020 from Kerala on a panel, and we know the Communist Party there very well. I mean, they literally positioned the state to serve society throughout the pandemic, and they democratized it. They went for it to bring society into the response and so on. And this government just refused to do that. So I really think that that's something for us to consider. I mean, even now, in terms of the vaccine rollout, if the government was consistent in ensuring that it worked with civil society and ensured that all these energies were brought to the fore, we would have had a very different situation with the vaccines. Anyway, that's my comment.
I'm not sure in what order.
You may proceed freely. Oh, unfortunately, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. Look, I mean, obviously the state didn't do all of these things and government didn't do all of these things. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that I don't think it's realistic to expect them to do those things. Because it does seem to me to be a bit odd that, a lot of our discussions in this country across the spectrum kind of start off by assuming that government is irredeemable, and then we have a whole discussion about how can we get them to change their minds. The point that I make in my book, the point I'm making about this is that the defeatism, for example, wasn't some kind of just state of mind. It was because they had a particular view of what was important and what was not important. And the reason for the defeatism was not some state of mind. It was the belief that a society with large numbers of poor people living in townships and shack settlements couldn't deal with COVID-19. And that in turn indicates a particular view of the world, which has to do with our trajectory over the last 27 years. And it seems to me a bit odd in that context to be discussing ways in which, how are we going to get government to listen? The issue is surely, are there, which I think was your question, I wonder, which is, are there trends in the society which indicate that might change? I think there are. The point is that they don't seem to lead to any sort of really challenging political movement. So Vishwas talks about some of the things people were doing on the ground. I think that there was a lot happening in very difficult circumstances on the ground, which indicates that people did want to protect themselves. And they were doing the best they could in the circumstances. The tragedy, if you like, which has been the tragedy in South Africa for a long time, is that this doesn't translate into a coherent social movement. And the obvious question is, why doesn't it? And I mean, I'm trying to understand this, but I mean, the argument I'm sort of really, and this is just off the top of my head, that I'm kind of grappling with at the moment, is that a lot of this has to do with the decline of the trade union movement. That at a particular stage in our history, mass politics may not all have been trade union politics, but the trade unions provided an excess, which doesn't exist anymore. But to me, that's a far more useful discussion than how anybody is going to get suburban South Africa to be non-suburban South Africa, because I don't think that's possible.
Thank you. So now, Natalya, you may go.
Yeah, no, just to sort of build on these questions and the points, it is interesting because at the beginning, you know, there was this big push for these CANS organizations. There was a Gauteng CANS and a community activist networks, you know, that were providing food and other kinds of support. And it is interesting why they weren't sustained, why they didn't grow. They were clearly sort of lacking a united ideology. It was a very broad grouping of people from very different, and it was led by middle class South Africa, I think. So they didn't really find resonance in you know, in the majority working class communities. So, but also I think that there was no left leadership and voice. And yeah, part of that is, I think it's an international phenomenon, you know, the decline of trade union movements in Britain, in America. And well, it was not just, they didn't decline spontaneously, they were vigorously attacked and decimated in Thatcher and Reagan's eras and have not been able to recover. So I think that those are some things that we need to ponder on. But even a sort of provision of an alternative, I found that many of the interventions and grassroots activities were really lacking in imagination and could not sustain themselves, therefore, because they couldn't adapt to the new world that we face ourselves in. And also a lack, I think one of the other big issues was no emphasis on solidarity as a ideology, both, you know, local, national solidarity with refugees, solidarity with women, solidarity with anybody, has been left out of much of the discourse. And I think that's a good starting point, that we need to see that we're all on the same side internationally and nationally.
And those were great input from our speakers there. Just to echo some of those, some of what was said with regards to us finding ourselves within a new world, the answers already being shown and exhibited throughout society during this crisis, and the fact that we have to extend solidarity and recognize that we are together in this globally and locally. Are there any hands from the other participants that they would like to direct questions to our panelists? No hands, any takers? Since I don't see any questions yet, I'll just ask those.
I wonder, can I ask Stephen and Natalya questions about
Go ahead, Vish.
science? So Stephen, I mean, in your book, you know, you really get into the politics of knowledge and ultimately science. And so could you elaborate on the kind of progressive science? I mean, Natalya has also been alluding to it, that we need to have been working with. Maybe Natalya, you want to say a bit more about that? I mean, you started talking about what's wrong with pharmaceutical industries and so on. But, you know, what is the appropriate science for us to be grappling with in the midst of this pandemic?
Sorry, do you want me or Natalya?
You can go first, Stephen.
Yeah, Vishwas, I think if you look at the science I'm talking about, it starts from the premise that we must do whatever we can to save lives and disrupt lives as little as possible. So, I mean, this is fairly basic stuff. So it puts human life and human health at the center. And I don't think our response did that. So, for example, as you know, because you read, I mean, I mentioned in the book this debate about flattening the curve or smashing the curve. Now, for those who are not familiar with that, flattening the curve means this obsession I mentioned earlier with the health system. And remember, you know, the problem with the obsession with the health system was not only that it's true that we don't have an appropriate health system. It's also that it was built on mythology. I mean, I make the point in my book that I talk about how no scientists were held to account. Nobody ever bothered to find out what was going on in the hospitals. And I don't mean in the sense that, you know, the usual South African story about PPE, etc. If you say that you're trying to ready the health system, you're saying that the health system can save people's lives or it can help them. But nobody ever produced any evidence that that was happening. I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm just saying we were never told whether it was or not. And that's a very different type of science from the science which was on the other side of the debate. And that was the science which was saying, look, the discussion is not about whether we can save the health system. The discussion is about saving lives. And we do what we have to do to save lives. You know, that's a very different paradigm. And it's interesting to me that the way it plays out at the moment is that the mainstream, and not only the South African mainstream, I mean, if you look at international media, etc., they are, to put it bluntly, so freaked out by the idea that some societies have been able to cope with this pandemic, that they have to undermine it the whole time. So during the current Delta variant wave, we keep on hearing that South Korea is in deep trouble. South Korea's idea of deep trouble is what in South Africa would be regarded as the end of the pandemic, okay? Because if they have several hundred cases a day, they regard that as a crisis. We haven't ever had less than 1,600 cases a day. So it's simply, I mean, there's nothing magical about it. I mean, Natalya is right to say that science is never neutral. It's the science of people who are about saving lives and protecting human health, not the science of people who assume that this is all about a particular set of technologies. And that, as Vishwas, you pointed out, which I deal with at some length in the book, but I don't have time to talk about, you know, that saving the economy, in inverted commas, was very much part of what is supposed to be the science here, and all the scientists bought into it. The problem about that approach is that even if you take a conventional approach, if you don't offer any criticism of the existing economic order, it's flat wrong. The evidence shows very clearly that the only way to revive the economy is to beat the pandemic. And yet that was never part of our response, because every time it might have been part of the response, suburban South Africa started yelling about the pain of travel agents. I will shut up now, but I mean, it's obviously obvious of mine. I make the point, and it's worth reflecting on, that if you looked at international news media, for all their faults, and they are many and varied, we saw pictures on international media of the things people were going through in hospitals. We never saw that here. Up until now, we never saw pictures of ICUs, of people on ventilators, etc. All we saw were pictures of travel agents complaining that they didn't have enough business. So that's the science that we used here, and fortunately, it's not the science everybody used. Sorry, I went on a bit, but thanks.
Natalya, you may go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, so to what Stephen was saying, so when not only do we not value human life, we don't value the life of the planet, and we are so very much interconnected with, you know, from fungi to microorganisms to, you know, big animals and plants. And so that's not center for today's world order, and profit is center. And that has really run the response to the pandemic, guised or thinly guised as a kind of science, but underlying it every single thing in terms of the response, every aspect has been with profit lying and maintenance of the economy lying at the center of it. So in fact, I did mention it, the more that the system's been able to plunder government resources, PPE, and it's not just South Africa, in the UK as well. There've been, great scandals where the Tory government and their pals have made huge profits from their track and trace system, from PPE and so-called and other COVID mechanisms or interventions. So that's the first thing. So until we have a health system that is not commoditized, it cannot be otherwise, I think, in any significant way. So the countries like of China, for example, I mean, Stephen gave the example of South Korea, but China as well, locked down with a few hundred cases, locked down tens of millions of people and provided support for them. It didn't just, shut them up in their houses, but they provided at great financial cost, monetary cost. But at the end of the day, as Stephen said, they came out better. Kerala, one of the poorest places in the world, and Cuba also managed to do, because their health is preventative health. And preventative health isn't profitable. If we stop people from getting diabetes, we're not going to sell diabetic drugs. So it's really, really under emphasized. And we in the Department of Health, the preventative department, health prevention is really, non-existent now, as curative is the only way to go. And South Africa's bought right into that. So we need to develop preventative health measures. We need to decommoditize the health system. I mean, also the fact that no one bothered to find out what's going on in the hospitals, because I worked at the Krisani Baragwanath Hospital and Rahima or Coronation Hospital for over 20 years, there is zero capacity to even look at. I mean, the cancer registry was closed more than 20 years ago. We don't know what's going on. It's so hard to even track causes of death and maternal mortality. There is zero capacity to look at what's going on and even to feed hospital admissions through. And that's because, again, the private sector is all about profit and, getting their bed rate up. And the public sector is just about moving people through it, and hobbling along. I looked after many patients during this epidemic. And for people in hospital, I mean, there was really nothing much that the doctors tried hard, the nurses tried hard, but there wasn't very coherent, there wasn't a very coherent response. And the system didn't get what it needed from the government in any way. That money was really sort of taken long before it reached the hospital. So I think in terms of an appropriate science, again, I think we need to look at science that is driven by a non-commoditized, non-profit ideology. And only that way will we sort of find answers in preventing the next pandemic, because the next pandemic will come along. As we destroy our environment, the next pandemics will come along. And capitalism is producing these crises in fires and floods and pestilence at a rapid, increasingly rapid rate.
Thank you, Natalya. Crispin, you may go.
Sure, I was just thinking about an experience I had in June where somebody asked me to take him to a local clinic. He said, no, I can't go to the hospital, it'll take too long. So I went to a doctor's clinic, and it was just a remarkable experience of, well, this is private health care for the masses. It was relatively cheap. I mean, I think the whole process cost us 200 Rand or something, and it included him getting some methadone, which he needed to get. But it was absolutely shocking experience of just the numbers and being processed in the crudest possible way. We did see a doctor. I think the consultation lasted maybe 60 seconds, 75 seconds, something like that. And it really struck me that people are willing to queue here and pay all of this money for something that the public system should be managing. And that's very worrying about how it is that the public sector is failing poor people to this extent. Yeah, so I don't know if there are any particular comments on that.
Panelists, anyone like to go first?
I wonder. So, may I talk?
You may go.
Yeah, no, just to look at that. Even a really, I mean, the blatant disregard for solutions at the expense of profit was the whole ivermectin debacle. Ivermectin was pushed as a possible response, and so you had on one hand the pharmaceutical companies saying that this is nonsense and this is rubbish, desperate people on the other hand saying, but what can we take? And the government could have, the World Health Organization could have put more resources in getting the answer to whether ivermectin is helpful or not very, very easily and very quickly. And they refused to do that. They refused to do that. Only today we find that ivermectin not only doesn't work for aspects of COVID-19 or clinically in mild, moderate or severe disease, but we know that in severe disease it's harmful. And I have seen myself people, and so what we had though was situations, a complete breakdown of the situation where patients I've had that have been harmed by ivermectin, not because ivermectin is a dangerous drug per se, but because the drug that we were getting in South Africa was from unmonitored and factories that had, so the quality control was missing. And Wits pharmaceutical department did a study and they found 80% of the ivermectin samples that they tested were highly contaminated with other drugs, such as antihypertensive, anti-epileptic drugs. So people were not taking ivermectin here, but they were buying it on the black market and selling it on the black market in huge desperation. And that was just illustrates a breakdown of the system that's supposed to protect us from taking harmful substances, and also an example of the fact that even the World Health Organization, which by the way, the biggest private funder, and I was surprised to see that the World Health Organization does accept private funding, but the biggest private funder of the WHO is the Bill Gates Foundation, who are very pro certain aspects of, and have a very Malthusian and almost eugenicist approach to health and to people. So that was the one issue. And this idea that is, almost just of herd immunity, again, that we've been sold, is a eugenics approach. There's no valid science in so-called herd immunity. It's used for certain populations of vaccine-related epidemiology, but it doesn't work in pandemics, the idea of herd immunity. And it is an approach that it doesn't matter if old people die or vulnerable people die in society, the fittest, the strongest and the fittest will survive. It's an awful ideology that's been pushing dodgy science. So we need really to make sure that these systems of SAPRO work, these drugs don't come into the country via the back door that are unproven in their value. And we need to sort of really look at a different kind of science that works for people and for the good of all of us.
Thank you, Natalya. Would any of the other speakers like to take a stab at that question?
Nothing from me, I wonder.
Yeah, me neither.
I'll just follow up with another question that Crispin asked in the chat. Natalya, how can you say such horrible things about ivermectin? It must be good because my plumber offered to sell me some. Are there any other questions in the chat or from any of the attendees, sorry? I'm seeing no hands currently, so I'd just like to ask the panelists if they'd like to give a final inputs before we close. We can go in any order. Or let's go in the order of speakers. So begin with Natalya first, then Stephen, then Vish.
Okay, just to end, I mean, Vish said, what do we see as the end of the pandemic? I'm not quite sure what he means, but all pandemics in the history of pandemics come to an end. And they're trying to sort of show us or tell us that, we're going to be stuck and have to live with corona. And we're stuck in this cycle of fear and, of each other. And then we mustn't go out in the street and campaign for Black Lives Matter or trade union rights. But pandemics do come to an end. No pandemic, whether it was the bubonic plague or the Great Flu epidemic of 1918, they come on the back of capitalist crises often, or great structural crises, and they do come to an end naturally. What will happen with this pandemic, with this particular virus, is, as all viruses do, we will get develop a immunity that we will be able to pass on to our children. And viruses adapt and mutate not to kill their host. It's not in their interest to kill their host. It's in their interest to live with their host. So viruses that have been with humans for tens of thousands of years do not cause us huge disease, and they don't kill us unless we're very, very, very immune compromised. But viruses that come from animals that we're not used to will kill us rapidly, such as Ebola. But what happens, and it's happened with syphilis and HIV, is over the decades, we become used to each other and we don't die so rapidly. I think that COVID will become, as the Spanish flu virus or the great epidemic of 1918, that virus became less pathogenic and didn't kill us as much. So that this will happen with coronavirus. Our problem is the new viruses that will come if we continue farming and destroying and degrading the land as we are doing so now.
Thank you, Natalya. Stephen?
No, just to reiterate and the point that I made earlier on, I get a bit frustrated by the fact that we tend very often to look at structural issues in our society and reduce them to the failures of particular individuals. Nothing that I've argued about COVID-19 is about who should have been the scientific advisor and who should have been the minister and who should have been anybody else. I argue that these things happened because there are certain social realities which make them happen. And I think that if we want to change those social realities, we need to talk far more about those social realities, and about what it is, what are the realities of the society that might change them. I think that's a far more productive route to go than to say that the people who govern us don't care very much about poverty. I mean, I think that's been kind of established, and I think we really need to move to seeing, which is what I try to do in the book, to see this as a reflection of the kind of society we are, and then to ask questions about how we might become a different society. Thanks.
Thank you. Vish?
Yeah, so I think we're going to be watching something very interesting around the vaccines. And it's interesting that capital is making the push to take the vaccines to the people. And again, you're going to see the state in lockstep with that. This is not a bad thing to take vaccines to the people, but it's interesting where the cues are coming from and where the prompts are coming from in South Africa. My last point is that I think that we also have an unviable society. And I think that's catching up with us. I think that expressed itself also during the July violence. I don't buy the thing that this was just, this was an insurrection. I think there was some level of instigation, but there was a lot of discontent. There was a lot of suffering on the ground that was influenced, that was harnessed, etc. But we're going to get into that conversation now. So let's see what comes to the fore. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our three speakers for their insights and inputs on the political ecology of the COVID crisis. I think we've really touched deeply into the state of things, where we are coming from with regards to our ability as a state to address this crisis. Gave us a little bit of perspective, particularly regarding the way things have gone and the way they could have gone. Because I think it really came out clear from all of our panelists that the way in which this has been addressed was not the only way in which it could have been addressed. And it's important for us to deal, reflect, and think about that, particularly when you are constantly being bombarded with in the mainstream media with regards to the way in which things have occurred. And I think that there's obviously a lot that we can go deeper into with regards to where we are with this crisis, how much longer we'll be in it, and how we will be positioned to face future crises. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists once again for their insights. And I think now the time is 11:49, 11:50. So we're going to take a break. I'm not sure, since we just went a bit over time, how long will this break be before we move on to our next panel? I think we've lost Jane. The internet just dropped her out. So just gonna wait for her to come back just to get some guidance on timing for our next panel, which we were supposed to start.
I just want to suggest we stick to the program because many people wanted to be here, but they're very busy, and so they're working with the scheduling. So many of the speakers, even on the second panel, are going to join us, but they'll come in at 12:10, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, then we'll be back at 10. I mean 12. Sorry, we'll be back at 12. Thank you.